Saudi Arabia exists, but it has existed for only around 100 years. So in this video, we look at how modern-day Saudi Arabia was created. Chapter 1. Early History. Modern-day Saudi Arabia is located on the Arabian Peninsula, which is this region of the world. Saudi Arabia goes through a climate cycle. At first, it is like it is today, a dry desert. But when the Earth's tilt shifts slightly, the Sahara and the Arabian Desert point directly at the sun. As a result, this region gets hotter than it is today. Hot air expands and becomes less dense. As a result, it draws in denser air from the surrounding regions, such as the Mediterranean Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and in the case of Africa, also the Atlantic Ocean. Clouds pour in and the Sahara and the Middle East are turned into gigantic grasslands, forests, and jungles. Over the last 7 to 8 million years, they have undergone at least 230 cycles such as these. On average, a cycle lasts around 30,000 to 35,000 years. This time span is called the African humid period. However, it extends into the Middle East as well, creating a vast grassland connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe together. It allowed animals to go from one continent to the other. This is why tigers, elephants, and lions both live in Asia and in Africa. About 90,000 years ago, there was one such African humid period, and a new animal had evolved to spread out of Africa: Homo sapiens. This warm period allowed humans to leave Africa and travel into the Middle East. When the African humid period ended, the Sahara and the Middle East turned back into deserts again, just like they are today. Humans were cut off from each other, and dry landscapes forced humans to settle along the rivers of the Middle East and go to Europe and Asia. Then, a few 10,000 years later, the Earth tilted again and another African humid period began. According to genetic data, there were several of these waves of migrants as Africa and the Middle East turned from desert to grassland to desert to grassland again. And the last African humid period ended around 8,000 years ago. And just to be clear, a lot of this information was discovered in the last 10 years or so this information is likely not entirely accurate. However, there is very strong evidence for this, it's just limited at the moment. So we might be off by a few millennia or a few centuries here and there. However, with the last African humid period, the Middle East turned into the dry region we know today. The people living there were left with two choices. They could either leave the region and find a better place to live somewhere else. But most of Europe and Asia already had people living in it at that point, meaning they would have to compete for hunting ground, foraging areas, and fresh water sources. The second option was to stay and flee to the few remaining fertile areas, settling along oases and the Nile, Euphrates, and Tigris rivers. Food was scarce, so people had to find new ways of making food. They began organizing their fruit trees, their berries, their grain. Groups of people who could organize food production most efficiently soon found themselves into conflict with those who couldn't. In order to survive, they were forced to create new ways of organizing their life to manage food production, defense, and storage of food for when they couldn't produce enough. They created agriculture, cities, and eventually kingdoms. The very first civilizations were created in these regions in order to secure food for all their people, such as the Babylonian Empire in modern-day Iraq, the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, and ancient Egypt in modern-day Egypt. And those civilizations soon found each other. And when civilizations find each other, they fight each other and they trade with each other. The safest way to trade between, for example, the Babylonian Empire and ancient Egypt was to travel via Syria and Palestine, staying close to the coast and the fertile coastal regions. Then moving to the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile rivers from there. But the fastest way to travel was directly via the Arabian Desert. And in that desert were the descendants of all those people who had chosen to remain behind when the African humid period ended. They had formed their own group of people, an Arab people, and they did not have access to a large river for agriculture. They could not create large civilizations and could not create leather goods, most crops, or various tools. Instead, they formed tribes, oasis towns, and coastal settlements. But those people also wanted what those civilizations could produce. And luckily for them, they were surrounded on all sides by other large civilizations. However, they had very little to trade themselves. So instead, they decided to earn money by buying goods on one side of the desert and selling them for a profit on the other side. Ships from the Indus River civilization traveled along the Arabian Peninsula. Being surrounded on three sides by water, coastal towns were created to supply those trade ships, and it allowed a lot of people on the peninsula to work in international trade. And trade caravans crossed the deserts, passing through various oasis towns to resupply each time. The people living in this region used their profits to buy the stuff they couldn't produce themselves. This lasted until the Bronze Age collapse between 1200 to 1150 BCE, in which a series of events that are still not entirely clear caused the collapse of all the civilizations in the area or severely weakened them. As a result, trade decreased, and the Arabian Peninsula's wealth was diminished. And this process would happen several times throughout history. As civilizations rise and fall, the Arabian Peninsula would grow or decline based on the trade with those civilizations, cycling through a period of flourishing trade and diminishing trade. Chapter 2: Islamic Unification. The Arabian Peninsula remained mostly a trade region inhabited by towns and tribes, but this changed in the year 610, because in that year a man called Muhammad said he received a message from one of God's angels, and ended up creating the religion of Islam. Mecca, located on the Arabian Peninsula, became one of the most important destinations in that religion. For more details on the life and creation of Islam, please watch my video on it, which I will link at the end of this video. Mecca had been a religious center before Islam, however, that was mostly for regional religions. But Islam turned out to be a massive success. The religion and its followers' armies spread out across Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. And a big part of being a Muslim is that you have to undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, at least once in your life if you are able. Suddenly, Mecca became a major tourist destination for Muslims, and this new Islamic empire underwent a golden age, making major contributions to medicine, biology, philosophy, astronomy, arts, and literature. Arabic became the language of science and medicine, but over time, Islam began to fracture into different empires. New states emerged, and eventually the Arabian Peninsula became independent again. Those empires would often fight for control over that peninsula, usually supporting local factions in order to do so. And as technology advanced, it eventually became possible to set up colonies on the peninsula as well. And two countries in particular were interested in this region. The first were the British. They eventually set up colonies in modern-day Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain. These regions were used to supply British ships traveling to and from India. In the 18th century, the British began conquering India, and with it came more trade between them. The Arabian Peninsula became an important stopping point for British trade. In fact, the Arabian colonies reported to the British governor in India instead of the government in London, because they were just that important to Indian trade. The second colonizer was the Ottoman Empire. They expanded their influence all the way from Hungary to North Africa to the borders of Iran. But there was one part right next to their empire that had always been difficult to colonize: the Arabian Peninsula. Therefore, they began supporting local factions who in turn supported the Ottomans. However, the empire was never able to truly conquer all of it. The Ottomans simply didn't have the ability to ship enough men and material to conquer the region and occupy it. They tried for centuries to take over, however, never truly succeeded. Chapter 3: The First Saudi State. Yet during all of this, the Arabian Peninsula remained largely divided. Dozens of tribes, towns, and city-states vied for power, many of them receiving support from larger empires nearby. But in the 18th century, the idea of a united Arabian Peninsula began to take hold. A peninsula united through Islam. It started with a man called Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. He preached that Muslims were no longer following the true teachings of Islam and that they had been led astray. He created a new version of Islam which he believed to be the real Islam, and it was called Wahhabism. But he was persecuted for his teachings and had to flee. He eventually found refuge in the town of Daraya, inside the Emirate of Daraya, which was ruled by Muhammad bin SAUD. The two men formed an alliance in 1745. The Emirate would adopt and spread Wahhabism, and in exchange, Wahhabism would teach that the Emirate of Daraya was the natural custodian of Muslims because they were the only ones who believed in the correct denomination of Islam. This strategy worked quite well, and in 1765 a new ruler took over, and that new ruler used the idea of an Arabian Peninsula united through Wahhabism to launch a series of conquests across the region, conquering all of these territories you see on screen right now. Most significantly of these conquests is that the Ottoman Empire had controlled Mecca and Medina since 1517. In 1803, the Emirate of the Raya conquered Mecca, and in 1806 they also conquered Medina. They showed the Arabs that it was finally possible to stand up to the might of the Ottoman Empire. But this was something the Ottomans could not let happen. You see, at the start of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was dying. Their influence in Europe had diminished, its territories and vassals were slowly being taken away by other powers, and their outer regions were rebelling. The Ottoman Empire was in a slow decline, and that became very evident to its leaders by the start of the 19th century. The government began lashing out in order to keep what they still had. They became more aggressive, so they would not look as weak as they truly were. Eventually, Islamic preachers from the Raya began spreading Wahhabism to the Ottoman Empire, thereby threatening to take away even more land from the Ottomans under the banner of a united Arab state instead. And so, in 1811, the Ottomans decided to go to war with the Emirate of the Raya, and as part of that, they ordered their vassal Egypt to invade. It took 7 years, but in the end, the Ottomans were able to bring their artillery into the desert and destroy the city of Daraya, one of the largest cities on a peninsula at the time, and they made it permanently uninhabitable. The Wahhabites' belief in the righteousness of their cause and their extreme fanaticism made them blind to the actual difficulties of challenging the overwhelming might of the Ottoman Empire, even within their own territory. And this led to the destruction of the Emirate of the Raya, the very first Saudi state. Chapter 4. The Second Saudi State, the Emirate of Najd. While the Emirate was defeated, the Saudi royal house was not. The House of SAUD began their quest to restore their power, and a member of that house, called Turki bin Abdullah al-Saud, or Turkey for short, wanted to regain his family's power and influence in the region. In 1824, he managed to conquer the town of Riyadh, about 35 kilometers south of where Daraya once stood. He created the second Saudi state called the Emirate of Najd, and Turkey decided to make Riyadh his new capital from which to start his campaign of conquest. And they were reasonably successful, conquering all of this territory again. But they also could not stand up to the might of the Ottomans, and in 1838 the successor of Turkey was captured and the Egyptians installed a puppet on the throne of the Emirate of Najd. 2 years later, however, the Egyptians were facing another crisis and were forced to retreat again to focus on that instead. The puppet on the throne of Najd was then overthrown and a new ruler was put in place. But this also caused a tradition of infighting in the Emirate of Najd. The new ruler of the Emirate did not go on a warpath, but instead focused on trade and agriculture. This peace was shattered when he eventually died in 1865. His sons, following the family tradition, began fighting over who should control the new state. And in this fight, some of those sons requested help from the Ottoman Empire. At this point, in the 1860s, the Ottoman Empire had crumbled even further. In order to regain some of their old power, they decided to invade the Arabian Peninsula while the Emirate was fighting a civil war. The Ottomans overthrew the Saud family and installed a puppet of their own. Then, they split the Emirate into various countries to make it easier to manage. As a result, the Ottomans were able to defeat the Saudis once again because they had better weapons and soldiers. And in 1891, the last Saudi leader was forced to abandon the struggle. The second Saudi state, the Emirate of Najd, collapsed and his family fled to Kuwait in 1901, where the Saudi family had been granted asylum. Chapter 5. The Third Saudi State. Once again, a member of their family immediately went to work to regain their lost power. In this case, that man was called Abdulaziz bin Abdul Rahman al-Saud, or more simply known as Ibn Saud. He was only 16 years old when the Emirate of Najd was defeated, and was the fourth in line to be king. After his family lost power, he gathered a band of soldiers in Kuwait, and in 1902, he and 40 followers launched a night raid on the city of Riyadh, the former capital of Najd, and they conquered it with a surprise victory. He named Riyadh his new capital and created a new country called the Emirate of Riyadh. But one city is no country, so he began looking for allies in the surrounding Najd region, which is this part of the world right here. The southern Najd was controlled by the Badam tribes, and Ibn Saud tried getting them on his side. He had become famous for conquering the city in a single night with just 40 men, and that gave him a reputation as a good general. He then used this reputation to suggest that they should follow him, that he will lead them to victories against the enemies and promised they would all get rich from the plundering they would be doing. He succeeded getting them on his side, and by 1906 Ibn Saud ruled over the southern Najd region. From there, he and his allies focused on conquering the rest of the Najd region until they ruled roughly this territory around 1912. But, as was family tradition at this time, they once again came into conflict with the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans once again feared that a Saudi ruler would threaten the empire again. You see, by 1913, the Ottoman Empire was truly dying. They had lost almost all their territory in Europe and North Africa. They were massively in debt to European empires. Their industry was woefully behind, and they faced frequent rebellions. But the Ottoman Empire had a plan. They advocated a concept called Pan-Arabism. It's the idea that the Middle East should unite to form a single powerful country. The Ottomans argued that Arabs had a shared culture with the rest of the Middle East through Islam, and they could point towards various empires in the past which united a large portion of the Middle East, including the Arabian Peninsula. The Ottomans argued that there was therefore a shared culture, and the Ottoman Empire already controlled most of the Middle East, so they wanted to promote the idea that Muslims should unite under a single Islamic empire, but under the Ottoman rule. Essentially, they wanted to create a nationalist movement across the Middle East. The government would then give special rights to Muslims to make sure they feel part of this new Islamic empire. In the same way that today, if you are a citizen of a country, you get certain rights that other people don't have, such as access to welfare or the right to vote. But at the time, the Ottoman Empire was ruled mostly by the Turks, and the Turks and Arabs are two different ethnic groups. However, the Turks did rule over a lot of Arabs, so they wanted to create a nationalist movement both within the Arabs and the Turks, so that these two groups would form a single ethnic group. And they would base this nationalist movement on Islam, and that meant they needed preachers to preach the idea of Pan-Arabism. But if you remember, the Saudis had a very similar plan with Wahhabism, where they state that Muslims should unite under the Saudi government because the Saudis were the most devout Muslims who followed the true version of Islam, Wahhabism. And so the Wahhabists for the Saudis and the Pan-Arabists for the Ottoman Empire would compete with each other for influence. However, only one of them could win. And so the two countries once again found themselves at war with each other in 1913. This time over the region of Al-Hassa, a fertile oasis region. While the Ottomans were weak compared to European empires, they were very strong compared to the Emirate of Riyadh, particularly because the Ottomans had artillery. And no matter how tough you think you are, if you get into a fight with an artillery shell, you're going to lose. But artillery has one major weakness. Every time you shoot it, the explosion heats up the weapon. Normally, you cool it down by throwing water on it or by just letting the air cool it down. But in the middle of the Arabian desert, with 54 degrees Celsius or 130 degrees Fahrenheit, their artillery overheated and was unusable. As a result, the Saudis were able to drive the Ottomans out of the Al-Hassa region until they controlled all of this territory you see on screen right now. But because the Saudis now controlled so much territory, they decided to rename the government from the Emirate of Riyadh to the Emirate of Najd and Hassa. And with the Ottomans defeated, this emirate began the process of consolidating all the territory they had just conquered. They did this by creating an organization called the Ikhwan. They were a religious militia made up of nomadic tribesmen. They started out in 1902 as a group of religious preachers, but 10 years later, by 1912, they were adopted into the Saudi system as a fanatical fighting group. They would enforce a strict adherence to Wahhabism in the Saudi state. Within just 10 years, there were Ikhwan soldiers in 222 settlements. They proclaimed to owe allegiance only to God and to their king, Ibn Saud. These people would create a new segment of society who had given up the ways of the desert and started living in villages. It was this group of people around whom a stable society could be built, based on the shared idea of Wahhabism. These people became religious fanatics, and Ibn Saud presented himself as the defender of Wahhabism and therefore the defender of what he called true Muslims. And the Ikhwan would make sure that the people living in the emirate were forced to live according to Wahhabist ideals. Thereby, every child would grow up with the same values and the same culture. And from that, a nation could be built, united through Wahhabism. And the state would have to be the most Wahhabist of all of them. So Ibn Saud implemented various religious practices into the government. For example, generals had to follow Islamic rituals and military officers received religious education. And it was this army of religious fanatics that managed to defeat the Ottoman Empire. And in 1914, the Emirate of Najd and Hassa signed a peace treaty with the Ottomans to avoid any future hostilities. And luckily for everyone, no major wars were started in 1914. Oh wait. Chapter 6. World War I and European colonization. Just a few months after signing the peace treaty, the Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the side of the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was a desperate act by the Ottomans to stop their empire from collapsing. They hoped to regain territory they once lost to those European empires. They hoped to destroy all the debt that they owed to those Allied powers. And they hoped to revitalize their empire. However, the Allied powers realized the Ottomans were weak and decided to simply overwhelm them with their military. The British would invade from Egypt via land, they would invade from the Mediterranean via sea, and they would invade from Russia through the Caucasian mountains. And by 1917, they also invaded via Greece. On top of that, the Allied powers supported independence factions inside the Ottoman Empire. And lastly, there was this small country called the Emirate of Najd and Hassa, whose family had been in conflict with the Ottomans for over a century. And so, in 1915, the British began supplying weapons to the Emirate so that the Emirate would attack the Ottoman Empire. But there was a small problem with this strategy. The Emirate was still consolidating the territory they had just conquered, and they were fighting various rebellions of their own. And as a result, the Emirate didn't do a lot of fighting with the Ottomans or their allies. And then, a few years later, the First World War ended, and with it came an end to the Ottoman Empire. Suddenly, the Middle East was carved up between various European powers. For the sake of this video, what is important is that the Emirates' entire northern border was now British. And what those British wanted was to colonize further south into the Arabian Peninsula so that they could connect all their Middle Eastern colonies together. And with the Ottomans gone, the British had no more need for the Saudi government. And so the British began supporting other people and factions to rule over the Arabian Peninsula instead. For example, the leadership of Mecca was in the hands of a man called Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi. He was part of a powerful family called the Hashemites. And after World War I, they gained control over the kingdom of Hejaz in 1916 to 1925. They controlled Syria for a few months in 1920. They controlled Iraq between 1921 and 1958, and they controlled the Kingdom of Jordan from 1921 all the way until today. The British used the Hashemite family as a strong and reliable ally in the Middle East, which the British could use to take over the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. And so the UK withdrew its support from the Emirate of Najd and Hassa and instead began supporting the Hashemites instead. However, this video is about the creation of Saudi Arabia, not the creation of Hashemite Arabia. And while the Hashemites were installing themselves as rulers across the Middle East, the Saudis were crushing the last remaining rebellions within their territory. And in 1921, they had succeeded. And with that success, they also renamed their state from the Emirate of Najd and Hassa to the Sultanate of Najd. And this new sultanate was a threat to the Hashemites, so they found themselves at war with each other almost immediately. The first skirmishes started right after World War I was over, but the Saudi Ikham soldiers were able to fend them off. Those soldiers then turned towards Iraq and Kuwait with sporadic border clashes. They did not want to be at war with the Saudis, so by 1922 they signed a treaty with them to determine where their borders were, and they created a neutral zone between the Sultanate of Najd and its northern neighbors Kuwait and Iraq. Afterwards, the Saudis started another war with yet another Hashemite leader, the Kingdom of Hejaz. And the King of Hejaz was a Hashemite. He could therefore count on the support of other Hashemite rulers. And those other rulers were willing to support him because Hejaz controlled the all-important cities of Mecca and Medina. But then that ruler did something that wasn't very smart. He declared himself Caliph. In very simple terms, what this meant is that he was basically declaring himself the rightful ruler over all of the Middle East. But as you can imagine, telling all your allies in the Middle East that you are their rightful ruler and they should bow down to you isn't going to make you very popular. And if Hejaz conquered the Saudi territories, they might become strong enough that they could actually conquer the rest of the Middle East. So in order to prevent this, all of Hejaz's allies abandoned him. Without allies, the tide of the war turned in favor of the Saudis. And by 1926, the kingdom of Hejaz was conquered by the Sultanate of Najd. And with the conquest of Hejaz, it was time for yet another name change. This time, the Sultanate of Najd became the Kingdom of Hejaz and Najd in 1926. Over the next 3 months, their claims were recognized by the British, French, Soviet Union and the Netherlands, as well as most Islamic leaders at the time. An impressive feat considering most of the world at the time was colonized by those very nations. But why? Why would European colonial empires just give up on the Arabian Peninsula? Chapter 7. Uniting the Nation. The Kingdom of Hejaz and Najd was the third Saudi state, and they had just gone to war with almost all of their neighbors, while at the same time, countries like the UK and France wanted to colonize or vassalize the Arabian Peninsula. So why was the Kingdom of Hejaz and Najd even allowed to exist by them? Well, that's because, first of all, the Arabian Desert didn't have much to offer the Europeans. Back in the 1920s, oil had not yet been discovered there, and at that time, Europeans were more worried about the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, particularly the spread of diseases through the Hajj. That's because a lot of European empires had a lot of Muslim subjects, and the pilgrimage to Mecca is a very, very important part of Islam. It states that Muslims should make the journey to Mecca at least once in their life if they are able to. And this is what the Hajj looks like. Muslims walk around in a circle counterclockwise 7 times around the black stone in the middle called the Kaaba. They are encouraged to touch or kiss the black stone, but that would also require going all the way from the outside to the inside, brushing up against every other person in the meantime. To be clear, there weren't as many people doing the Hajj in the 1920s because there just were fewer people, but still, amidst these people, diseases from all over the world came together and had a little party as people breathed, coughed and sweated on each other during the Hajj. After it is over, those people then go home again, possibly bringing a concoction of diseases back with them. In short, the Hajj was a major health risk. And during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the countries of the world came together to limit the spread of diseases. And in 1926, the year that they won the war for Mecca and Medina, there was one such meeting called the International Sanitary Conference in Paris. And they invited the Kingdom of Hejaz and Najd to this conference. That's because the Sultanate controlled both Mecca and Medina, as well as all the major pilgrimage routes leading to it. And so the countries of the world were willing to accept the Saudis as rulers of these pilgrimage sites and much of the Arabian Peninsula, as long as the Saudis promised to limit the spread of disease through the Hajj. And so they were forced to create local health councils, medical facilities and first aid clinics all along the pilgrim routes. The work was slow because Saudi Arabia didn't have a lot of money and medicine is expensive. But at least the progress being made was slow and steady. In doing so, they were essentially saying to the world that they would reduce the spread of disease. However, if anyone ever invades them, they would no longer be able to maintain those health services. Essentially, they were bribing the world to leave them alone. Saudi Arabia was therefore legitimized because of healthcare. But just because others recognize your rule doesn't mean your own people will accept your rule. To unite the nation, the government spread a collection of religious texts teaching Muslims how to practice Wahhabism. This was meant to educate the people on how to do Islam properly. And in very simple terms, it stated that most Muslims couldn't distinguish between right and wrong anymore, and that therefore the government should teach the people. And that government, of course, was the Saudi government, because, as they said, they were the only ones following the correct version of Islam. Part of his teaching is that Muslims could only worship God himself. They banned various festivals which the government viewed as worshipping Muhammad or anything else that wasn't the Muslim god. Then in 1926, they destroyed the domed mausoleum of the Baqi cemetery in the city of Medina. The tombs held the remains of prominent members of the Prophet Muhammad's family and were sites of devotion, reverence and remembrance for many of the world's Muslims. To give an example of just how impactful this decision was, imagine if Italy conquered the Vatican, then created a new denomination of Christianity and started destroying parts of the Vatican which did not align with that Italian version of Christianity. That's basically what the Saudi government did, angering other Muslims, but creating unity in their own country through Wahhabism. To force the practice of Wahhabism onto more people in general, the guides bringing people to Mecca during the pilgrimage were forced to only teach Wahhabism, meaning that Muslims who were performing the Hajj were forced to learn Wahhabi Islam in the process. Over time, those guides were forced to report on pilgrims and fellow pilgrim guides who did not follow Wahhabism. As a result, they became a surveillance arm of the government to root out anyone who disagreed with the government's religion, and the pilgrimage became a political tool by which the Saudi government sought to legitimize their claim. People who disobeyed these new laws and practiced their own version of Islam were often punished quite harshly, with reports of violence being common in the 1920s, lasting all the way up to today, such as, for example, being whipped in the street. Countries who upset the Saudis too much were banned from going to Saudi Arabia. So, if your country has a Muslim majority, then those Muslims can't perform the pilgrimage anymore because they're not allowed inside Saudi Arabia. That will make those foreign people angry at their own government. So, if you're a Muslim majority country, you better keep Saudi Arabia happy to keep your own people happy. And the last major obstacle to uniting Saudi Arabia were tribal wars. The Arabian Peninsula had a lot of tribes which kept fighting with each other. This was a problem. So the Saudi government set up a new legal system. If someone broke Saudi law, then the chief of each tribe was responsible for the punishment of the criminal. If the chief failed to punish the offender, the chief of the neighboring tribe was responsible for taking action. If that neighboring chief failed as well, then Ibn Saud would send in the army. Everybody now had a clear system of rules on when they could invade a neighboring tribe, but also that if these tribes didn't uphold the law of the central government, then they will send in the army. This system of enforcement was effective, and for the first time in the history of the Arabian Peninsula, intertribal warfare and general lawlessness were controlled. Peace had come to the Sultanate. Chapter 8. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi state by 1928 had become a relatively stable and independent country in the Middle East, and as a result it was now time to stop conquering new land all the time. But this was a problem, because the religious fanatics that served Ibn Saud, the Ikhwan, did not want to stop. They essentially just wanted to keep going and going and going until every human being became a Wahhabist. But that goal is just a little bit too ambitious. Ibn Saud understood that declaring war on the whole world wasn't going to succeed. And so the Ikhwan started an uprising, called the Ikhwan Uprising. And as part of that uprising, they also started to raid Iraq and Kuwait from Saudi territory. As you can imagine, those two countries were not happy about that, and the Saudis were in no mood to get attacked by their northern neighbors because they couldn't control their own soldiers. And so they cracked down hard on the Ikhwan for 2 years, finally defeating them in 1930. And with that defeat, the Saudis finally managed to consolidate their territory. When this consolidation period was over in 1932, the country finally settled on an identity and transitioned one last time. The Kingdom of Hejaz and Najd settled on the name Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on September 22 in 1932. By the way, if you've ever wondered what the text on the Saudi flag says, this is it. There is no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, thereby emphasizing the Wahhabist legacy of Saudi Arabia. But this new kingdom faced a lot of problems. You see, they got most of their money from pilgrimages to Mecca. Pilgrims had to pay money as a tax. But in the 1930s, the world suffered one of the worst economic depressions in history, the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, people had a lot less money. And people who don't have a lot of money cannot afford to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca, meaning that Saudi Arabia in the 1930s was struggling to get enough money. They became desperate and started selling off various things. For example, in 1933, they sold the right to oil extraction production in a certain region. At the time, nobody knew for certain if there even was oil in Saudi Arabia in the first place, but they did want to go looking for it. But in the end, it turned out there wasn't any oil in the region they were looking. But just the hope that there might be oil in Saudi Arabia meant that the government could start selling licenses to extract that oil if they ever found it. And then in 1938, they did find it. They found oil, and not just a little bit. They found the single largest reserve of oil ever discovered. And a year later, in 1939, Saudi Arabia began shipping the first of its oil. So maybe now, Saudi Arabia could finally have some money. But then, just 4 months later, Germany invaded Poland and started World War II in Europe. Oil tankers are easy to destroy, and oil is important for a modern military. And as a result, Saudi Arabia could no longer sell the oil they were extracting because their ships would get attacked. And so, they mostly sat on the sidelines during the war as a neutral country. Though the Allies decided to provide some financial aid to Saudi Arabia in exchange for not selling oil to Japan, Germany, and Italy. But wars don't take forever, and Saudi Arabia began planning for the future. They created a joint venture with several US companies to extract and sell oil. This joint venture was called the Arabian American Oil Company, shortened to Aramco. At first, the revenues of Aramco went largely to the US government, but after World War II, the Cold War started, and the Soviet Union was just as eager to buy Saudi oil as the USA. And so the Saudis decided to renegotiate their agreement with the US, with the underlying threat that they could simply confiscate all the oil wells and refineries the US had been building up, and instead sell all the oil to the Soviet Union. Over time, Saudi Arabia began demanding a larger and larger share of the oil revenues from their own country. By 1950, 50% of its income went to the Saudis, meaning the government finally had money. And Aramco would eventually be renamed in 1988 to the modern-day name Saudi Aramco. But now, after World War II, the planet became a safer and safer place. Wars everywhere started to decrease, a trend that would continue until the early 2020s. And in that new, ever more peaceful world, it allowed many countries to develop. For example, countries like Iceland, Australia, and South Korea were all rather poor after World War II, but became rich by the end of the 20th century. The Soviet Union and its allies, while never becoming rich, still went from a largely agricultural society to an industrial society. And in Western Europe and North America, they experienced a baby boom, creating more wealthy people. And they all need oil to run factories, create chemicals, produce medicine, fuel, paint, clothes, and a wide range of other products. And many countries had their own oil, but nobody had oil that was as cheap as Saudi Arabia. And the country transitioned into an oil economy. This means that a significant part of the economy is made up entirely of oil revenue. To give just one example, in 2012, Saudi Arabia's income comprised 47% of oil. Nearly half of all money made in Saudi Arabia in that year came from oil. And this leaves Saudi Arabia with one major weakness, because other countries could also sell oil. And the more countries that sell oil, the more competition you have. And the more competition you have, the lower the prices will become. And if prices go down, then your profits will also go down. So Saudi Arabia helped to create a new organization, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, called OPEC. This organization is a collection of countries who agree together on oil production and oil prices in order to keep the price favorable for all of them. This is essentially a cartel, and the price of oil is higher because of it. They started relying on oil so much that in order to get more oil, Saudi Arabia even went to war with Oman in 1952 to secure the oasis of Al-Buraimi, because they believed there were more oil supplies underground. Oman had just declared independence that same year and was no longer protected by the British Empire. And technically, Oman and Saudi Arabia never agreed on an official border. And so the British came in once again to mediate a peace agreement with the two countries and finally settled on a border, the one we have today. From then on, Saudi Arabia would still be involved in foreign conflicts. However, they would no longer be fighting to gain territory directly. Instead, they would focus on gaining influence across the Middle East. During the Suez Crisis, for example, the British and French tried to take the Suez Canal, and the Saudis opposed them. In 1961, they sent troops to Kuwait to protect it from Iraq, and this continues all the way to today, where Saudi Arabia supports various militias, rebellions, and other groups to gain more allies in the Middle East. But the oil money wasn't just used for war, it was also used to build a society, infrastructure to connect towns, schools, universities, sewage systems, healthcare, palaces, apartment buildings and airports, replace the old alleyways and mud brick houses, all paid for with the profits from the oil industry. However, one thing they did not invest a lot in was to create other profitable industries. With all that oil money, they could have created basically any industry they wanted. And because Saudi Arabia is at the center of Africa, Europe and Asia, while being connected by seas on 3 sides, it meant their country is uniquely situated to be at the center of billions of potential customers. Out of all the countries in the world, there is no one with a better position for trade than Saudi Arabia. They could have turned parts of their empty desert into giant industrial zones, producing products for people on all 3 continents. They would become not just a trade hub and an oil hub, but also becoming a steel or computer chip or manufacturing hub. However, this did not happen. Instead, that money was divided among the Saudi family members. The reason for this was that these family members could oppose the Saudi king, and the biggest rival to a king is usually his own family who want to be king instead. So to keep everybody on the king's side, they just gave them all a portion of the oil money. And the money that was actually invested into the country focused on creating an internal economy that would keep people happy, but not necessarily wealthy. Saudi Arabia is essentially playing a balancing act between spending enough money on the people so they do not rebel, spending enough money on the elites so they don't start a coup, and spending enough money on the government so the country can keep functioning. And in the middle, there is no money left to develop new industries. And that is where modern day Saudi Arabia is today. If you like this video, then please give it a like for the algorithm and subscribe for more history videos. If you want to see another Arab video, then on the left we have a video about the creation of Islam. Or if you'd like to know more about the Ottoman Empire, you can click on the video on the right. This was Avery from History Scope. Thank you for watching.